How did Europe's economy end up being such a pathetic little shit? From seeing no growth in the past 15 years, importing millions upon millions of immigrants, being unable to deal with the Ukraine war, having to always rely on Big Daddy America for guidance and support, and having no clear leadership of its own. It's evident to everyone with a brain that Europe isn't doing so well. In fact, Europe couldn't be doing any worse. But how did this happen? How did Europe, which had effectively been the center of the world for millennia, end up being nothing more than a miserable pile of shit? And is there anything Europe can do to save itself? The sad reality is that there isn't one singular event that led to Europe's decline on the world stage, but a slow and painful process that was assisted by a series of catastrophically bad decisions by the European Central Command. Some were honest mistakes, and some were intentionally bad policies to damage Europeans as a form of punishment for all the pain and destruction they caused. And because I know the average viewer of this channel is like 6 years old and has the IQ of a really smart mosquito, which is not very smart, I'll try to make this easy to understand. The concatenation of demographic senescence, fiscal obfuscation, and regulatory hypertrophy, this exacerbated economic dynamics. On a serious note, back in 1995, the USA and EU each held around 25% of the world economy within them. For perspective, Japan and China controlled 18 and 1.5% of global economic output respectively. In 2023, the figures look a lot different. Japan and China more or less switched spots, with China at 19 and Japan at 5.5%. For the two aging superpowers, the change was much less dramatic, but it still shows a concerning trend. While the USA more or less held its spot at around 25%, the EU, even if you count the United Kingdom that left the Union a few years ago, which definitely didn't backfire, is barely above 20%. But why is that? Why does America and China keep growing with no end in sight, and we Europeans are still poorer than we were in 2007? At the core of Europe's failure lie two main issues. The first is the continuous cycle of incompetent leadership. The main event that made it clear to the world that European politicians were a bunch of glorified clowns was the 2008 financial crisis. Chess players often say good moves come from good positions, and it's obvious that Europe in 2008 wasn't in a good position and didn't even try to make a good move. Firstly, Europe, and especially a certain southern European nation, had a notoriously bad habit of misreporting economic data at the start of the crisis and for years before it. No major actions were undertaken to soften the blow of a potential future economic downturn simply because people thought that Europe was doing somewhat better than it was actually doing. But as we all know, that was proven to be wrong, and Europe was in much deeper shit than we thought. So that brings the question of why. Why did Greece lie so much in the lead up to the crisis? And the answer is pretty simple. For the euro, the nation's previous currency, the drachma was unstable, old, and mainly it was extremely hard to get a large number of loans at reasonable interest rates with it. But if Greece could find some way to ditch the currency in favor of the euro, all those issues would go away overnight through some very clever accounting. So clever, if they put the same effort in actually growing their economy, they would pass America in a week or two. They managed to convince Europe they were doing a lot better financially than they were actually doing. But as Greece would soon find out, those rules and requirements are there for some reason. And that's because one of the greatest tools nations have to deal with a downturn in their economy is currency fluctuations. The mechanisms behind this are extremely complicated. So complicated I have no idea how they work. Do I look like an economist to you or something? But all you need to know is that by devaluing your currency, you make everything in your nation cheaper to foreigners, so they buy more of your stuff, which in turn helps your economy. But it depends from country to country if this procedure would actually help the economy. Southern Europeans needed the currency to go down, while Northern Europeans wanted it to stay around the same levels. But by sharing the same currency, not everyone could get their way. Europe could either devalue the currency and save Greece while other nations suffer, or allow Greece to completely collapse, which might lead to a chain reaction of nations leaving the Union one by one after they saw that Brussels wasn't able to help Greece in a time of crisis. What eventually happened was something in the middle. The currency was devalued significantly, but at a very slow pace, and this slow and fearful response perfectly characterizes Europeans and their tendency not to take major risks. Europeans, compared to Americans, are very fearful of hyperinflation and the accumulation of debt, mostly because in the past century, a majority of European nations had experienced sky-high inflation rates and massive debt burdens, which often made nations collapse. And actually one of the main reasons WW2 started was because the German people were impoverished by massive war reparations and hyperinflation. So it makes sense that when 2008 happened, Europe completely turned off the money printers, and instead of focusing on growing their economies, they focused on repaying debt. The problem with this approach is that debt is relative. If you owe $500 but have zero income, you are in a much worse position compared to someone that makes $100K a year and owes $5,000. Same is for countries. Maybe the US owes $30 trillion, but with an economy approaching a 30 trillion GDP, it's not really a problem. For Europe in 2008, debt to GDP was around 65%, but because the GDP didn't rise at all, debt to GDP nowadays is approaching 85%, and in total, EU-wide debt has risen from an already high of 10 trillion USD to an astoundingly high of 16 trillion in just a decade and a half. But that is just half the story, and the other half is looking much worse, and that's because it's not some bad policy that can be fixed, or a bad approach to a crisis that could have been avoided. This issue is about the people that leave in Europe, and I'm not talking about Romanians, but something even worse, Bulgaria. This is a population pyramid. It simply shows us how many people are in each age group of a certain nation. The people under 20 and over 70, economically speaking, are completely useless. They don't add any economic value to society, while at the same time they are drains of public resources, and the ones that provide those resources are the people in the middle. So a logical conclusion you can make is that the more people you have here, and the less here and here, the better your economy will tend to perform. In economics, we call that the dependency ratio. This is Europe's population pyramid, and as you can see, the situation couldn't be any worse. Excluding people over 70, every single generation is smaller than the one that came before it, meaning that excluding migration, if nothing changes, the European population on a long enough time frame will reach a population of 0. By 2200, for example, the population will be less than 100 million, and by 2400 less than 10 million, and that's if we are lucky and the birth rate doesn't fall even further, which is not likely to happen if South Korea is anything to go by. And as you can imagine, many Europeans, mostly young and highly educated ones, after seeing the catastrophic direction Europe is heading towards, have made the hard decision to leave their homeland in search of better opportunities abroad, which only makes the situation even worse. Nowadays, Europe finds itself in a very dire situation. In 2008, the poorest US state, Mississippi, had a nominal GDP per capita of 24,000 USD. At the same time, Germany, one of the richest member nations of the European Union, hovered around double the number at 45,000 US dollars. Nowadays, the numbers look very different. While Mississippi has seen very strong and consistent growth for the last 15 years, managing to hit a GDP per capita of 50,000, Germany has remained at virtually the same level, only seeing slight growth up to 49,000 USD. Even though the numbers aren't adjusted to reflect the cost of living, they still paint a very dark future for Europe. Previously, I mentioned that Europe, right after 2008, turned off the money printers and instantly implemented austerity measures. But in 2015, after everyone already could see that those measures weren't successful, the European Central Command made the decision to print more money. So the question arises, did that help the economy? And the answer is absolutely yes, but with one little problem. Taking a look at nearly any European nation's GDP graph, you can see that for nearly every year before 2015, the GDP fell, and for nearly every year after 2015, the GDP rose. Obviously, I'm excluding the no-no virus and the special military illegal occupation, but we will talk about those later. But for now, we can confidently say that quantitative easing was relatively successful, and actually a multitude of nations, especially the poorer ones like Greece and Italy, saw relatively large drops in their debt to GDP rates during this time. But unfortunately, even though the European Parliament for once made the right decision, that seems to be a rare occurrence even today. With the most glaring example of incompetence and stupidity, Germany, for some reason, made the incredibly smart decision of turning off clean, safe, and most importantly, very cheap nuclear energy in favor of importing Russian natural gas. And as everyone knows, transferring complete control of your energy grid to the leader of a foreign power that has time and time again spoken publicly about how much he hates everything about you, while at the same time being in active combat against some of your closest allies, is a very smart decision. I mean, there is no way he would use that power over you as leverage to invade another sovereign nation. Even though I've spoken very negatively about Europe nearly the entire video, I have to give those fuckers a little credit. Europe has the highest standard of living out of any continent. Europeans are the happiest people on the planet, and even though their economy is complete and utter garbage, it still is hundreds of times better than other shitholes like Bolivia and Zimbabwe. But it's true that the nation has wasted a lot of its potential, and while a lot of things are being done to improve the situation, like minimizing bureaucracy and taking more serious measures against depopulation, they are still not enough. And also, Greece is effectively the protagonist of this story. If you want to learn more about the nation itself and how it got in the situation it's in today, just click here. Have a great day.